This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. President Milei scored a big victory in Argentine elections on Sunday. What does that mean for his economy and for the U.S., given its support? And President Trump's charging $100,000 for an H-1B visa may put some money into the U.S. Treasury. But what does it mean for innovation in a tech industry that depends on highly skilled minds from abroad? Plus, many of those highly skilled minds are focused on developing artificial intelligence models. We sit down with Nobel laureate Geoffrey Hinton for an update on his story about where AI is taking us and whether he's as worried about the possibilities as he told us a year ago. But we start with the big story for the markets this week, the Federal Reserve's latest rate decision. Our special contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard, is here with his take. Larry, we heard from the Federal Reserve this week, and they cut again, second time in a row. Were you surprised at how far Chair Powell went in saying don't expect it in December?
I was slightly surprised, but much more importantly, I was glad. This was the right thing to do. Inflation is much further from its reasonable target than unemployment is. The Fed can have much more of a durable impact on inflation than it can on unemployment. Given deficits, given AI spending, we're probably at or below the neutral rate of interest. There was no reason to be committed into further rate cutting in this environment. So Chair Powell signaled a return to data dependence, to agnosticism about what was going to happen next. That was exactly the right thing to do. Yes, there are risks of a slowdown, but if we get a slowdown and the Fed does a 50 basis point cut 6 weeks later, that is not going to be important. But if the Fed loses its credibility around inflation at a moment of massive deficits, massive political pressure from the administration, substantial international uncertainties, evidence of higher inflation expectations, and it's been a long time since inflation was near 2%. In the face of all of that, this was really the right thing to do.
The Fed may be data dependent, but it doesn't get the data that it once did out of the federal government. How much of a disadvantage is that for the Fed right now in figuring out where we are, particularly when it comes to inflation?
It's a disadvantage, but there are now so many indicators, so many real-time data sets, things like the Million Price Project at MIT, all sorts of sensitive indicators that are being followed by people in the markets on an almost weekly basis, that this is unfortunate, and it's not what a serious government country does to have such a long slowdown, but I don't think it's an immense problem in the grand scheme of things. It's certainly a much smaller problem than politicization. It's a much smaller problem than dealing with budget deficits. This is not the major challenge facing the Fed.
Chair Powell in the news conference talked certainly about inflation. He also talked about the role of tariffs. And at one point he said, look, if you take tariffs, the effect of tariffs out of the numbers, we're actually not that far away from our 2% goal. If that's right, which way does that cut? What do we do with tariffs, incorporating that into monetary policy?
Well, we're not that far away from 2%. After 5 years of being above 2%, isn't that great a place to be, even if you accept that that's true. You can always take some things out of the numbers and then say we're near normal. That kind of argument reminds me of what was Chair Powell's darkest moment in what I think has been a really very distinguished term of service, which was the transitory inflation idea in 2021. Yes, maybe it's true that if you take out tariffs, the numbers will look good, but because people are spending more money on tariffed goods, they're spending less money on other goods whose price is lower, and that should be taken out as well. So I don't think cherry picking the components that have risen is a particularly good way of doing the analysis. I also think it's not clear what's going to feed through into people's expectations of inflation.
One thing that was different about this Fed decision were the dissents. I mean, we went for a long time with no dissents. Last meeting we had some dissents saying we should cut more. This time we had them both ways. Don't cut it all and cut more. Is there a breakdown in the consensus on the Fed, or is it just a more confusing picture we're seeing?
I think it reflects two things. It reflects the confusion of the picture, and I think that the dissent from Kansas City in favor of raising rates reflects, or not cutting rates, reflects what is the genuine argument among serious economists in this moment. The dissent from Governor Miron reflects the bizarre spectacle of a government official, part of an administration that's at war with the Fed in its rhetoric, putting somebody on the Fed on a temporary basis while they're on their leave from their other Senate-confirmed job. I think that that's not to be taken seriously as anything but a politically aberrant moment.
The Fed also said that as of December 1, they'd stop the roll-off of the balance sheet. Is that reflecting a real concern about liquidity? Did you expect them to keep the balance sheet this large?
They signaled that this kind of thing was going to happen. I don't think particularly that the precise size of the Fed balance sheet in an era where we're paying interest on reserves is really that important a variable. In an earlier era, when the other side of the balance sheet was money that paid zero interest, the era of monetarism, you could get very excited by the size of the Fed balance sheet. But I don't find it that exciting a variable to worry about its precise size. I do think it's important for the country as a whole to be terming out its debt more than we have. And from that point of view, the Fed reducing the size of its balance sheet is probably a good thing because it means a little less short-term obligation of the federal government and a little more long-term obligation.
Shortly after we had the Fed meeting, we also had President Trump meet with President Xi Jinping of China over in South Korea. And there were a lot of things announced. President Trump said on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 12. But there seemed to be a consensus that what we've done is basically just go back to where we were before, and this is going to be an ongoing period of negotiation. How significant, in terms of the economy, is what happened over in South Korea?
Look, I think the most important thing is what didn't happen. This situation didn't spiral out of control into massive confrontation and economic conflict. And it was managed in a way that avoided what potentially could have been very unfortunate and destabilizing outcomes. And that's the good news, and I think it genuinely is good news. I am glad for farmers that they are going to sell more soybeans in China, but ultimately, when one judges the prosperity of the United States in this period or the wisdom of economic policy in this period, it is not going to be about the level of soybean sales to China. So we're going to have to see what happens. The really big issues involve technology, involve competition in artificial intelligence, and it doesn't look to me like, on the read we have so far, that those have evolved a lot. But give credit where credit is due. I think there's a good chance that we elicited some real cooperation on fentanyl, which is not so much an economic issue, but is a hugely profound social issue. And give credit where credit is due. We're managing the situation towards the avoidance of what could otherwise be very substantial turbulence. But this is book that's got many chapters, and we are still in the early chapters.
Larry, talk about that technology issue that you mentioned, and particularly when it comes to AI. One of the things that apparently was not discussed were some of the advanced microchips from NVIDIA. I mean, you are both a macroeconomist and also sit on the board of OpenAI, so you have a vantage point on this. How do you see the issue about export controls with respect to advanced microchips between the United States and China? On the one hand, there are national defense issues. On the other hand, we do want to have sort of a development of this new technology.
I think it's a very difficult set of issues, and I don't know what the right answers are. I'm pretty sure that the right thing to do is to make judgments based on what will protect American national security now and in the future. And so the approach that President Trump took a couple months ago of saying he would relax the export controls, but only if the company involved would share some of the revenue with the federal government, did not strike me as consistent with our traditions. It struck me as more pointing towards a kind of deals capitalism that is more characteristic, frankly, of lesser nations than ours, rather than a more rules-based capitalism.
Coming up, a victory for President Milei of Argentina and for President Trump in the United States. What lies ahead for both? President Milei's historic victory on Sunday in Argentine elections means he has a stronger position in his Congress and another opportunity to administer his medicine seeking economic health for a country that has been struggling for a long time. Hans Humes, CEO of Greylock Capital, is a longtime investor in Argentina.
I think the entire country understands what has held them back for decades now. And they're willing to take a certain amount of personal pain. Now we have to see how this transition goes and what the new messaging will come if Peronism is able to prevail in October.
Muchas gracias.
But in the end, Peronism, the populist legacy of Juan Perón, did not prevail, at least not last Sunday.
Los argentinos le dijeron, basta el populismo, populismo nunca más.
I think right now we've made a lot of money based on that election because the bonds have gone up, their whole debt rating has gone up. You know, that election made a lot of money for the United States.
What does Milei's latest victory mean for the country and for investors like Humes? This is how Humes saw the issues brought on by Milei's reforms before the midterm elections.
In general, at the beginning of a pro-market president, you're going to have a lot of enthusiasm. Unfortunately, you know, depending on how this one goes, people might start sensing a pattern that there's, after the burst of enthusiasm and the rally in markets, that something happens where they run into some social resistance or whatever. The feedback I got from sort of my lower middle class friends who are Argentine was many of their friends who are really enthusiastic for change started looking at this and saying, oh, this is the same thing we normally have to do. They either give up or they start turning away from Milei, and they put up with a lot of pain.
Runaway inflation has been a burden for businesses as well. Businesses like the textile manufacturer that David Kim runs in Buenos Aires.
Inflation is a game we really know how to deal with, because inflation in Argentina started in, I think, 1970 or something like that. And we've had inflation, double-digit inflation for many years. It is very difficult because you need to calculate the costs every month, and sometimes you have to, when inflation is very, very high, you have to increase the prices maybe once, or there has been some times when they have to make increases more than one time a month. Everyone that comes to Argentina and we explain all these crises and what happens politically and economically and the taxes and the new regulations, they say we are crazy to stay here. We are used to this. we will be here working in the textile business for many, many years. I think the business owners in Argentina deserve a medal because it's a very challenging country.
It wasn't just President Milei who had a lot at stake in the Argentine elections last weekend. President Trump had his Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, establish a $20 billion swap line for the country and spend something over $1 billion in the currency markets to support the peso. Fabio Nattalucci became CEO of the Anderson Institute for Finance and Economics after serving at the IMF as Deputy Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department.
At this point, there are 3 plans that have been discussed. One has been a swap line of about $20 billion established by the Treasury with the Argentina Central Bank. There's been reports in the press of FX intervention, so outright purchases of pesos and sales of dollars. And then there is a discussion of another about $20 billion that Treasury seems to be working on with the private sector, presumably to provide some more longer-term funding. This is that's what's in the press at this point.
How does a swap line work?
We can use the Fed as an example here. During the financial crisis, they established, or during COVID, they established swap line with the other central bank. The way it works is the Federal Reserve vis-a-vis central bank of another country, they swap, say, dollars for the currency of the other central bank at a specified exchange rate of some date. And those swap lines can go from 1 day to, say, 3 months maturity. And then at maturity, they swap back, the Fed receives dollars and provides back the foreign currency at the same exchange rate. The only report I've seen in the press has been outright purchases. Outright purchases by Treasury, that's a different exercise. Essentially, they go in the market, they sell dollar, they buy Argentinian pesos in this case. But then at this point, you own the Argentina peso. So you are completely facing the risk of devaluation of the pesos in terms of investment. Traditionally, there are a few examples in the past where some of this intervention has been done, traditionally with advanced economies. So for example, in 1998, there were purchases of yen by the US authorities via the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, traditionally. In September 2000, there was a coordinated effort by the Federal Reserve and a few other advanced economy central banks to purchase euros. And then lastly, in 2011, March 2011, during the earthquake in Japan, when the US authorities, they sold yen. Those are all advanced economy central bank. And in the case of the euro, this was a coordinated effort among different central banks to intervene in the market.
President Trump did say that he thinks perhaps the U.S. made a lot of money. I guess it is conceivable it could have made a fair amount of money depending on when it got in and when it got out.
Yes, so if they, for example, got in and purchased right before the election, and then let's say that the appreciation of the peso post-election was like 8.5%. Again, if you apply to the 1 billion, that would be $80 million that you made right there. Now, again, that requires though to crystallize those gains, which means you go back into the market and sell the pesos. If you hold on those pesos for 2 days, where you are this morning, that was a paper gain because the exchange rate is back to where it was essentially pre-election. So if you bought pesos and you hold on to them, you went from gains to back to essentially flat at this point. This is on the outright exchange rate purchases. The swap line, again, because the exchange rate is fixed, there is no gain or loss.
Whether the United States made money or didn't, that was not apparently the purpose for the swap line or the currency acquisition. It was rather to support President Milei and the government in Argentina. Is it likely it could have supported? I've seen, for example, speculation it relieves some pressure for a possible devaluation of the peso.
Right. So, I mean, maybe we can take a step back and trying to start from where the government of Argentina was trying to achieve. So as soon as President Milei went into power, they went into this shock therapy of cutting fiscal spending quite aggressively, and then a large devaluation of the nominal exchange rate. And then after that, they essentially established a band, a crawling band, as he said. So the depreciation of the pesos was very controlled and very slow, if you want. Of course, in last year, the economy went into a recession. Inflation was very high, doubled, north of 200%, at least quoting IMF numbers. that were just released at the October annual meetings. Then the forecast was for this year to the economy to sharply rebound in positive growth territory and inflation to come down. The challenge with this intervention in the spot market and the outright purchases is unless you manage to address the fundamental forces that are driving the exchange rate, those tend to be very short relief, and historically that's how they have been. And so historically the people often talk about the tablita in Chile and Argentina. Those were exchange rate based stabilization plan, devaluation, then slow devaluation of the currency in try to bring inflation down, and the central bank at some point historically has run out of foreign currency. That was the driving and fundamental forces behind that, and what may have pushed the US to intervene, because the central bank, presumably Central Bank of Argentina, was running out of dollars. Now the question that people have been asking is like, why the US intervened? How systemic is Argentina from a financial stability perspective? Argentina, the US imports, trade with Argentina, it's a relatively small number. And so from a trade perspective, there are other countries in Latin America that are much larger trade partners. The other aspect that makes this different than previous rescue package, that was a loan from the US Treasury, was not outright FX intervention the way we're discussing today, but also was combined with IMF, World Bank, and other multilateral development banks intervention package. So the $20 billion of the US plus what was coming from the multilateral development banks went north of $40 billion. So it was not just one country, not just the US for obvious interest to intervene, it was the broader financial community that intervened there, and that was a very successful package. Mexico managed to repay very quickly, already in 1997, so 2 years after that, was able to start repaying and also having access back to capital market. So the crucial question here is going to be whether the intervention in the forms we discussed by the US authorities will be enough to revert some of these fundamental forces that were pushing the exchange rate of Argentine pesos to depreciate. And again, from what we've seen this morning, the exchange rate seems to be almost back to where it was pre-election day.
At least for now, it looks like President Milei will have the opportunity to continue his economic policies that businessmen like David Kim hope will bring both stable prices and growth. I
think the president is doing a great job with inflation. Inflation has come down from maybe 150% a year to 40%. That's very good for everyone. But there are other issues that maybe you don't know about, maybe like the interest rates of banks. It's much higher than inflation. I hope there is a change here. I hope the politicians take into account that everyone is facing a difficult situation right now. The lowering of the inflation is great, but I think we need much more than that. Not only for textiles, but for every kind of industrial company.
Up next, a year after we first talked with him, we return to Professor Geoffrey Hinton to see whether his experience as a Nobel laureate has given him a different perspective on the risk that the artificial intelligence he helped create will destroy us all in the end. This is a story about preparing for the worst, maybe the worst thing any of us can imagine. A year ago, we talked with computer scientist Geoffrey Hinton, just days after he won the Nobel Prize for his work in machine learning. The so-called Godfather of AI has been busy since then, not developing artificial intelligence, but warning people about it. He says we've all become more aware of the risks, but knowing about them isn't enough. We need to act.
Suppose that some telescope had seen an alien invasion fleet that was going to get here in about 10 years. We would be scared and we would be doing stuff about it. Well, that's what we have. We're constructing these aliens, but they're going to get here in about 10 years and they're going to be smarter than us. We should be thinking very, very hard, how are we going to coexist with these things?
Coexistence and control, two things that Geoffrey Hinton himself has been thinking very hard about. As one of the computer scientists who helped make modern AI possible, he's uniquely well suited to consider its future and who, if anyone, can shape it. Are there companies who are doing real work on safety? I mean, we hear about Anthropic, we hear about DeepMind. Are they helping on the safety front?
Yes, I think both Dario Modi and Demis Hassabis and also Jeff Dean, they all take safety fairly seriously. Obviously, they're involved in a big commercial competition too, so it's difficult, but they all understand the existential threat that when AI gets super intelligent, it might just replace us. So they worry about it a bit. I think that some companies are less responsible than others. So for example, I think Meta isn't particularly responsible. OpenAI was founded to be responsible about this, but it gets less responsible every day, and their best safety researchers are all leaving, or have left. Yeah, I think Anthropic and Google are somewhat concerned with safety, and the other companies less so.
As I talk to some of the people at some of the companies you're talking about and raise the question of safety, I often am told, don't worry your pretty little head about it. We have great computer scientists who are on top of this. We're far off from any real danger, and our computer scientists will know soon enough. So we're much more concerned about the race to become dominant.
Yes, that's the problem. They are much more concerned about the race. They should be much more concerned about whether humanity will survive it. Also whether society will survive it if we get massive unemployment. There's one piece of good news, which is all the different countries are aligned in not wanting AI to take over from people. They're anti-aligned for things like cyber attacks or autonomous weapons. They're somewhat aligned for creating viruses. None of them really wants other countries to create viruses. On AI taking over, they will collaborate because nobody wants that. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want AI to take over. Trump doesn't want AI to take over. They can collaborate on that. That leaves the question of how do we prevent it taking over? Even if all the countries collaborate, what do you do? And I think at present, all the big companies and governments have the wrong model. So their basic model is, I'm the CEO, and this super intelligent AI is the extremely smart executive assistant. I'm the boss. I can fire the executive assistant if she doesn't do what I want. And I just sort of say, make it so, a bit like Star Trek. And the super intelligent AI makes it so, and I get the credit. Great. It's not going to be like that when it's smarter than us and more powerful than us. That's just the wrong model, I believe. We need to look around and say, is there any model where a less intelligent thing controls a more intelligent thing? And we have one model of that. And it's a model we all know, which is a baby controlling a mother. Evolution put lots of work into allowing the baby to control the mother. And the mother is actually often more concerned about the baby than about herself. It doesn't work like that with rabbits, but it does work like that with people. That seems a much more plausible model of how to coexist with a superintelligence. But we have to accept that we're the babies and they're the mothers. Hopefully they're not Jewish mothers, but you can't imagine these tech bros accepting that model. They just don't think of the world like that.
Is the United States behind China in developing generative AI right now?
Not yet. The United States is still a little bit ahead, but not as far ahead as they thought. And in China, you've got a very large number of very competitive, very smart people, very well educated in science and engineering and math. They're educating far more people than the US in those areas. The US has basically relied on immigrants to be smart at those things. China may well overtake the US, and if there's one thing you would do if you were Chinese to ensure that China overtakes the US, is you would stop the funding of basic research in the US, and you would attack the good research universities. Trump looks like he works for Putin, but actually in attacking the universities and attacking the funding of basic science, he's acting as if he's working for Xi.
How deep is that damage? By the way, it's the immigrants you talked about as well. It's not just the direct funding for the research, it's also the brain power coming in from overseas. How deep is that damage and how immediate may we feel it?
The point about attacking basic research is you don't really feel it for 10, 15, 20 years. Because what you do is you ensure that the really big conceptual breakthroughs won't happen here. And then later on, the Chinese will be way ahead.
Regardless of who becomes the front runner in the AI race, Hinton says the risks to everyone have gone up over the past year, particularly for workers, as we saw just this week when Amazon announced it would be cutting 4% of its workforce, perhaps made both possible and necessary by unprecedented levels of AI investment.
There's been an enormous amount of money put into AI since you and I spoke a year ago. I mean, a amount that I could not have conceived of, actually.
I mean, of the order of $1 trillion if you add it up over all the companies.
So what is that money going for, and will it ultimately redound to anyone's benefit?
These are big companies run by serious people, and presumably they wouldn't be putting all that money in unless they thought they could get a return on it. There's some ego involved. They want to be the ones to do it first, even if it's going to kill us all. So there's ego involved, but presumably they think there's returns to be made. My worry is that the obvious way to make money out of it, apart from charging fees to use the chatbots, is by replacing jobs. The way you make a company more profitable is replace the workers with something cheaper. And I think that's a big part of what's driving it.
Is it a winner-take-all in the end? I mean, in terms of
I don't
basics?
know. I don't know. I mean, one thing I should say is that this is sort of uncharted territory. We've never had things almost as smart as us, which we have now, or things smarter than us, which we'll have soon. We've never been there. We've had things in the Industrial Revolution that got more powerful than us, but we were always in charge of them. You know, a steam engine is just a lot more powerful than a horse, but we control the steam engine. This isn't like that. Also, if you got unemployed because you used to do ditches, now you have to do something else, you could get a job in a call center. But now those jobs are all going to go. It's not clear where those people go. Some economists say these big changes always create new jobs. It's not clear to me that this will. And I think the big companies are betting on it causing massive job replacement by AI, because that's where the big money is going to be.
As you say, some economists say we go back in history and new technology destroys some jobs but creates other jobs.
Yes.
And net, you have as many or more jobs. You're saying this time is different. Can the investment, the $1 trillion or more investment, can it pay off without destroying jobs?
I believe that it can't. I believe that to make money, you're going to have to replace human labor.
Given the dire warnings about AI's risks to workers, economies, and humanity as a whole, one wonders whether Geoffrey Hinton has any regrets about his pivotal role in giving it life. We asked ChatGPT how it would describe its relation to the man many people call its godfather. Its answer? If I'm the mature rainforest, Hinton is one of the people who planted the first seeds and figured out how to water them. Still, the question of whether it was worth it is the one that gave him pause.
To ask an unfair question, you were sort of there at the birth. If you had it within your power, understanding it's not going to happen, would you stop AI altogether, given the risk?
I don't know, because there's also, you have to remember, it's not like nuclear weapons, which are only good for bad things. It's a difficult decision because it can do tremendous good too. In healthcare and education, it'll do tremendous good. And in fact, if you think about it increasing productivity in many, many industries, that should be good. The reason it's bad is because of the way society is organized, so that Musk will get richer and a lot of people get unemployed, and Musk won't care. I'm using Musk as a sort of stand-in. That's not on AI, that's on how we organize society.
I wonder if over the last year, the economy and the markets haven't worked against you. In this sense, so much of the growth in the stock market, so much of the driving the economy is investment in AI right now. Even if the public were more concerned than they are about some of the risks you described, they're going to say, wait a second, that's what's driving our economy. We don't want to give that up. We don't want to go into a recession.
Some people say that our best hope is to have AI try to take over and fail. We need something to really scare the shit out of us. Something like Chernobyl for AI. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's certainly a possibility.
Or the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All the Cuban
nuclear.
Missiles
Okay, so one of the questions I had was, even if the governments sort of agree in general we should do this, is there a sense of urgency? I think the Cuban Missile Crisis probably gave a sense of urgency on nuclear disarmament.
Yes. We need something to make people pay more attention and put more resources. So at present, the big companies aren't going to put like a third of their resources into figuring out how to make it safe. But if it tried to take over and only just failed, maybe they would.
Coming up, looking for a better way of bringing highly skilled talent to the United States. Is charging $100,000 per visa really the way to go? What do Elon Musk, Satya Nadella, Indra Nooyi, and Sundar Pichai all have in common? They all, at some point, were in the United States on an H-1B visa. This is a story about putting a price on opportunity, like a $100,000 price. Last month, President Trump responded to years of complaints about how the much sought-after H-1B visa for admission to the U.S. gets awarded.
The country would rather not have to pay $100,000. How do you do that? You hire an American.
$100,000 fee is a huge, huge increase on that. This is very significant for these organizations. And just to sort of highlight how big this change is, the fees for an H-1B visa, they've never been cheap, right? So they have ranged from $3,000 to $10,000, which is not minor.
That $100,000 price tag is sure to hit the highly skilled people coming to the U.S. each year. People like Vijay Ravi.
I actually did my bachelor's in India. Then after that, I decided that, I really wanted to do more in life and have more opportunities. So that's when I decided, okay, let me go to the United States.
Ravi lived in the U.S. for 6 years on an H-1B visa. He came from India, the country that uses the visa more than any other, and earned his master's degree in data science at the University of Texas at Dallas.
I got my first job in Miami. It was a great achievement for me. It was my first real job. And I was really lucky because my H-1B got picked in the first attempt itself. I was so excited that, my stay in US was actually solid, it's like settled. And then I got another job in New York City. It was for an advertising company. And the H-1B transfer process also was very smooth.
But then things changed.
I did around 3 years at that company and I was laid off, unfortunately. I must have applied for around 1,000 to 2,000 jobs in 3 months. I actually got a lot of interviews actually, but in the end, in the final round or in the second round, they're like, oh, we cannot sponsor the H-1B. After 2 months, I understood this is just going to get worse.
Ravi's H-1B visa was part of a program that began in 1990, designed to let highly skilled workers into the country from abroad.
They've been around since the Immigration Act of 1990, and actually, there's been almost no change to them since then.
Britta Glennon is an assistant professor at Penn's Wharton School of Business who has studied the effects of the H-1B visa program on business and the economy.
They're a skilled immigrant visa, so they're primarily used for those who have at least a bachelor's degree, if not, master's or PhD. They're really the primary skilled employment visa for immigrants. They are tied to a firm, right? So something that's sort of important to recognize is that you actually cannot get an H-1B visa without an employer sponsoring you. And the employer actually, they're the ones who submit the application, not the individual.
The U.S. limits H-1B visas to 65,000 each year, with 20,000 additional visas for those getting graduate degrees from U.S. institutions. But several times that number apply, which has led the U.S. to create a lottery to pick visa winners, and to criticism about the overall approach.
It's pretty clear that we need more than 85,000, and just the fact that demand is so much higher than supply every single year, I think exemplifies that. I mean, when it was first formed, demand was below the cap. They ended up raising the cap in the late 90s because demand started growing as you had kind of the internet boom, right? And Silicon Valley became much more significant. And then that expired in 2004, and basically since then, supply and demand have been on completely different trajectories.
The big mismatch between supply and demand has created large business opportunities for companies not looking for skilled employees themselves, but to getting visas for workers they can provide to the companies needing them. In 2023, nearly half of the H-1Bs went to outsourcing or staffing companies. Todd Schulte is the president of FWD.US, a company that focuses on reforming the U.S. immigration and criminal justice systems.
So there's been, over the years, efforts by companies, and I would say a lot of bad actors, to basically kind of game any particular system here. Really, it's a function of Congress has failed to update our immigration system in a lot of ways here.
Yuri Leskovic is a computer science professor at Stanford, but he's also the founder of AI tech startup Kumo.ai, the sort of company that the H-1B visa was supposed to help.
Lottery, I think, doesn't make sense, right? Lottery, maybe large organizations who are able to sponsor many visas and kind of play the numbers game, they can deal with that. But if you think of a small garage startup with 3 employees who want to sponsor 1 or 2 visas, and the probability of them getting that visa is maybe 10, 20%, it puts a huge risk at this startup being able to grow, being able to hire, and being able to move fast.
As many problems as there may be with the old H-1B system, it's far from clear that imposing a $100,000 fee will make things better.
The problem with this is that it may have unintended consequences because small organizations, small startups won't be able to afford that large of a price. And this is going to, maybe in the short term, we won't see the negative effect of this, but in the long term, the most innovative companies of the drivers of today's economy started as small garage startups. And if we are killing these most innovative companies that are kind of just being able to be born and kind of slowing their progress, that is going to have tremendous effect on our economy.
How do you set up a recruitment process where you're picking and choosing on the front end who you think is worthy of an additional $100,000? How do you scale that? And the answer is you can't. So there may be ways that they may be able to try to find ways to get some of these people to come here, but there's no consistency to that. It's not about getting, for big companies, 1 or 2 people. It's about how do you get the right number of people each year. What about small companies? I mean, if you're a 6-person startup and 2 people need a $100,000 H-1B visa fee, well, okay, like what if you only have $100,000? Are you picking and choosing? And the answer is, we're gonna hurt small companies, we're gonna hurt big companies. And then for research universities, there's no university in the United States, no matter how wealthy, who can sit around and say, we're gonna pick and choose on the front end each year who's worthy of an additional $100,000 fee. So that means scientific innovation is going to happen, but it's going to happen in other countries. We're going to have less innovation, we're going to be a sicker country, and the things that we've talked about doing, bringing manufacturing back, creating jobs for everybody here, just isn't going to happen.
It appears that the Trump administration's new $100,000 visa fee may already be having a chilling effect. Walmart, the largest H-1B retail user, has announced that it will no longer sponsor applicants. On the other hand, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang praised the announcement. And just last week, the DHS clarified that college graduates on student visas and certain foreign workers already living in the U.S. will not have to pay the hefty fee.
There's been some confusion, I think. So when it was first announced, it sounded like all H-1B visas would have to have a $100,000 fee, maybe annually. It's still not clear whether it's annual, whether it's one time, whether it applies to new, whether it applies to continuing, whether it applies to for-profits as well as nonprofits and universities.
An arbitrary lottery or charging $100,000 aren't the only 2 ways of allowing highly skilled workers into the United States. Several countries limit those admitted not by the numbers, but by the skills they bring with them.
Countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, to some degree the UK, all use a points-based system where they basically say, we're going to allocate points for different qualifications. So we're going to say, if you have a PhD, you get a certain number of points. If you speak English, you get a certain number of points. If you're in a high-demand field, you get a certain number of points. So their view is clearly that you just allow in sort of as many high-skilled immigrants as possible.
Having employers bid in an auction for highly skilled workers is another possibility.
A market-driven mechanism would be something like an auction where firms could actually bid on H-1B visas, and then it would really be, the firms and the market determining the right price. $100,000, that's arbitrarily chosen by the government. This is absolutely not a market mechanism.
There may be no perfect way to put a price on opportunity for highly skilled workers wanting to come to the United States, but getting it wrong could lead the workers we need to look for opportunity elsewhere.
One way to think about it is, if you make this so expensive here, one, it's going to stop people from getting this way, but two, it's going to push back here, and now U.S. universities aren't nearly as attractive, right? So if these coming out are going to cost you an extra $100,000, trying really hard to make it so that, the University of Texas in Austin is a top U.S. university is just a lot less appealing if you can't stay in the United States. So we're pushing backwards in harmful ways, and we're pushing forward in harmful ways here.
Are you limited in your growth at your startup company by an insufficient supply of highly skilled people coming from abroad?
Definitely. Just a few years ago, about 60% of AI talent was based in the United States. Now that number has dropped to 40%. And I think having access to the top talent, being able to hire quickly and being able to grow and scale is the only way how US is going to remain competitive in this environment.
Which takes us back to the H-1B recipient Vijay Ravi, who came to the U.S. to get his graduate degree and become a part of the American workforce, but ran into stiff resistance and is now pursuing his opportunity in his native India.
You can live a really, really good life in the United States, but with the current administration, I don't recommend them to come to the United States right now. And I myself wouldn't think of coming to the United States, because right now I feel like I have a very good lifestyle. I have a good work-life balance. I get to travel and I get to work at the same time, and trading that for the immigration stress I get in the United States, I can't even think about it. It's too much for me to handle.
Next, Geoffrey Hinton on 2 different threats from AI. Since he received the Nobel Prize for his work helping to create AI as we know it, Geoffrey Hinton has used his platform to warn us about the risks of the thing he's partly responsible for. And those risks can easily be confused between its being used for bad purposes and its being bad in itself.
Okay, so I want to distinguish 2 completely different kinds of risk. There's a whole bunch of risks to do with bad actors exploiting the power of AI. So fake videos, cyber attacks, lethal autonomous weapons, people creating new viruses very easily using AI tools. The thing we already have, which is AI being used to decide which video to show you next and showing you something that'll make you indignant. So you get these echo chambers where you only see stuff that makes you indignant. I mean, if you offered me a video of Trump doing something really stupid, I'd immediately click on it. Those are all the risks that come from AI being powerful and being used by people and controlled by people. And then there's a completely separate risk, which is AI itself becomes the bad actor. This stuff gets smarter than us. We've created an alien being, or many alien beings. They can communicate with multiple copies of themselves much better than we can communicate. So people don't really understand this might just be a much better form of intelligence. If you take multiple copies of the same neural net running on different hardware, each copy can look at a different bit of the net, can figure out how it would like to change its connection strengths to absorb the information in that different bit of the net. And then they can all talk to each other and say, why doesn't everybody change by the average of that? And every copy will have now benefited from the experience that all the copies get. Now imagine if 10,000 of us can go to university, each person does 1 course, and every few seconds you communicate with your buddies, and everything you learned, they automatically learn. So you each do 1 course, and at the end you all know what's in all 10,000 courses. That's what these things are like. It's a better form of intelligence because it can share, and that just makes it very scary. People haven't really absorbed yet that we're creating alien beings that might just be a lot better than us.
Is it true that, in fact, the neurological, if I can call it that, approach was in disfavor at one point, but Canada was the place that people like you came to because it was much more popular here. Is that true?
There's some truth in it. So there's three researchers in particular, me and Yoshua Bengio and Rich Sutton, who all came to Canada because this research was funded in Canada. And Canada funded quite modest funding for the basic research, but sustained for a long time. And that got very good graduate students like Ilya Sutskever to do their research in Canada. That made a big difference. It wasn't just Canada, but Canada punched way above its weight in getting the basic research done because it funded basic research driven by intellectual curiosity. It didn't put huge amounts of money into things that were going to be immediately applied, which is what the politicians always want to do, because then they can say, look, we're doing this. Politicians don't get up and say, look, we're funding basic research, and in 20 years' time, this might have a big payoff. People aren't interested. But that's what Canada did. It did have a big payoff. The same thing happened with the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry is basically based on research done to understand the structure of DNA and proteins that was done out of intellectual curiosity in the 1950s. That led to this huge pharmaceutical industry. Similarly, the research, people studying neural networks and trying to understand how the brain computed, the research they did led to what we're seeing now, but it took a while.
And that neural network approach is dominant, is it not, in the field at this point?
It's more or less completely taken over, yes.
I have heard it suggested that recognizing that is the dominant model and will be, that bringing back in what I think of as the symbolic logic part of it could actually help govern the neural network approach.
Yeah, I don't believe in that. So I have an analogy for that. Suppose you believed in gasoline engines. And someone comes along and says, electric engines actually work better. Eventually you're going to say, okay, I believe you, electric motors are good. So what we're going to do is we're going to use electric motors to inject the gasoline into the engine. That's what that approach is. They're trying to save their old symbolic approach by sort of putting it on top of neural networks, which are doing the real work. That's not what we need. They've been saying for years, we need to make a hybrid. But if you look at all the progress, these chain of thought things where you can see what they're thinking, they don't think in some strange symbolic language, which is what AI people expected. They think in English. They have a string of English words, and you can see what they're thinking.
So as you've followed the discourse since you received the prize, what's been missing? I mean, you say that there is more talk about safety and things, but what are we all missing that you would love to get out?
There's a couple of things that are really missing. One thing that's missing is the general public doesn't understand the risks. And I think that's one of my missions, is to get them to understand. If you look at what happened with controlling the big energy companies, the public had to understand about climate change. You had to get scientific consensus, and then the public had to understand. And then the public provided pressure on politicians that opposes the pressure from big energy saying there shouldn't be any regulations. What we've got at present is big AI is saying there shouldn't be any regulations. I mean, they say they're in favor of regulations, but whenever you suggest a particular regulation, they're against it. We need the public pushing in the other direction, because politicians will go wherever the pressure pushes them. And if they're just hearing from the lobbyists of the big AI companies, they'll say, you know, regulations are terrible, they'll interfere with innovation, the Chinese will get ahead. The public has to understand what these risks are to provide pressure in the opposite direction, particularly all the shorter-term risks of people misusing AI. Then there's the appreciation of the longer-term threat of AI itself taking over. And people can't, very few people really understand that emotionally. Even I don't really understand it emotionally.
We've talked about the enormous investment being made right now in data centers and all the ancillary phenomena. Is it possible that the markets could end up being something of a brake on development of AI? If, in fact, this turns out to be something of a bubble, which some people are talking about right now, overinvestment, the return on investment doesn't come as quickly or as large as we thought, people become disillusioned. Is it possible there could be some disinvestment that would slow it down?
The first thing to say is anything's possible, right? Nobody really knows what's going to happen. These are strange times. It might slow it down a bit, but you have to remember that you're already using lots of AI. AI based on neural nets actually works very well. It's useful for many, many good things, like reading medical images. It's been slower than I thought for it to completely take over, but it's very useful for that. Lots of radiologists now have AI assistants. It's not like it's speculative that people are hoping this stuff will work. People know this stuff already works very well and it's going to work better. So it's not a bubble in the sense that, hey, this isn't really going to work. It works very well, and that's why it's not going away.
You won the Nobel Prize in Physics for your work on generative AI. How has that changed your position, your ability to speak out on issues? Have you been able to influence the discourse because of that position?
It's made people listen to me more. I got to talk to Jon Stewart, probably because I got a Nobel Prize, and I've always wanted to talk to him. I actually even invented a new term. So you know what mansplaining is?
Yes.
So when you got a Nobel Prize, you can do knobsplaining.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.